This is the fourth week of Lent, and our series has been walking through the desert. And the stories of Lent have been the stories from the faith family, stories of those who their life has led them through different circumstances beyond their control into the desert, into the wilderness, a place that is barren, that life is difficult, where it's hard to find sustenance, and it's even hard to make it day in and day out. And so this morning, you'll hear from Steve and Karen James as they share a couple of stories in their life and how God has walked alongside of them and given them strength and given them hope despite the difficulties that they've faced. As with the stories that have been shared and those that will be shared, these stories are incredibly sensitive because they are our scars. And in telling them, we open up our scars and we share the stories of how we receive them, much like Christ did for us when he met with the disciples after his resurrection and was identified with them and by them from the scars that he had from his crucifixion. And so would you join with prayerful spirits and prayerful mind, give them a chance to share their story. Steve and Karen, would you please come up and bless us with the words that you have to share today.
So short, I never can get on these stools. Oh, there we go. Okay. We lost our older son, Matthew, at the age of 22, back in July of 1991. To this day, he is still one of Indianapolis's unsolved murders. I know that sounds like a long time ago, and we didn't know most of you when all of this happened. A few of you know our story, but probably most of you don't. Such an event like this is life-changing and stays with a person forever. At the time, our nephew was living with us for the summer, and he said, "This is something that happens to people you see on TV, or people you don't know. It doesn't happen to your own family." How did this event affect my faith journey? And it's different for everyone. That's why I'm telling you my story, and Steve will tell you his. For me, rather than being in a desert, I felt like I had fallen into a deep, dark pit. And I was totally alone. Because we had another son who was alive and needed us, I knew I had to find a way out of that pit. Because of a life-altering event when I was 15, I learned, for me, how to survive tragedy, incredible loss, and pain. At that time, I felt there was no one who could or would help me. I'd been raised in a Methodist church, which was about a block from our house. And so, after school, I would walk down to the church, and I'd sit in there by myself and look at the cross and pray. So many times I didn't even know what to pray except to cry out for help. I don't think anyone ever knew I was there, and I don't really remember how long I did this. But eventually, God gave me the will to live. You notice that I felt I needed to be in church to talk to God. We weren't a family that talked about God or faith or prayed together. We went to church every Sunday, so I guess that I thought that was where God lived, and so I needed to go there to talk to him. When Matt died, I knew I had to go alone to God, because this is what I'd done before, and he saved me. I couldn't tell Matt or Steve, I couldn't tell Steve or Aaron that I needed to do this. I just hoped that maybe they could see that I had to reach out to God in my way and maybe as an example for them. I learned that at a very young age that only faith in God could get me through devastation. I also felt I needed to be strong for Aaron's sake. Because I had dealt with my devastation alone as a teenager, I didn't want him to have to experience the same thing. I grieved, I talked to God privately, but tried to be present and focused on family when I wasn't alone. I'm sure there was the perception that I was doing really, really well because I really couldn't share my grief with others. It was too painful, and I thought I might completely fall apart and never get myself back together. We were blessed to be members of a very loving church family and had a lot of friends who came and took care of us and took care of so many things in our lives. I probably don't even know all that they did to this day. As much as I appreciated having them there and all that they did, I still had to deal with my pain alone and with God. There's no time limit on grief. I liken it to being shot through with a cannonball. Eventually, the wound heals, but the hole is always there. Moving on doesn't mean that you forget about things. It just means you've accepted what has happened and you've decided to continue living. I had to find some normalcy in an extremely abnormal situation for me and for my family, for their sake as well as my own. I also knew I didn't have the capacity to help Steve and Aaron because I had my own grief to deal with. I could only encourage them to seek the help they needed. I can't imagine what people do without faith and without a personal relationship with God. And I know that He's in control and He will always be with us and never leave us. I also knew that regardless of whether the person who did this was caught or not, God would see that that person at some time answered for this crime. In fact, as the years passed, I came to believe that God spared us the pain of a trial. Even if there were a trial, we might never know why this happened, and I didn't feel the need for revenge. During times of great loss, I have rarely experienced the feeling of anger. It's so much deeper than that. I have felt just a profound loss, an incredibly deep sense of sorrow. It's especially at times like this that I know without a doubt that God's in control and I'm not. Patrick asked me to talk about my unwavering faith during this time, and I don't know how to answer that because I just knew God was there. I can't tell you how I knew, but I knew. For me, He's always there. He's always there to listen to me when I need to talk. He's my rock, my anchor, and I see Him as my Father with unconditional love. I've only told you about my story and my experiences, and Steve needs to tell you about his.
Am I on? Whoa. Am I? Am I on? Okay. Okay, what she said. So, no, first of all, I define faith as God, and in my life, faith was on the low side, actually, most of my life. I mean, we went to church, but I didn't really have a close relationship with faith until God sent her to be my rock and to help me through my faith and growing my faith. We had a lot of situations in our life that required faith, and she was alongside me, pushing me in that direction. So that's what God did for me, even to the extent of when we talked about later on in our marriage how much we should give the church. Karen says, well, we will give the church our tithe. And I said, well, let me figure out what 10% of net is. And she said, no, it's 10% of gross. And since then, we've kind of done that, and we've been blessed for that. So kind of my story is that on an early Saturday morning, I got a call from Indianapolis Police Department saying that my car, which Matt was using, was down in Indianapolis with the motor running, and they couldn't find him. And so I thought he had just left the car running and gone somewhere, and I took my son Aaron with me, who was able to drive at that time, and we headed down towards Indianapolis, got to Pebblebrook, and then got a call from the Marion County Sheriff Department asking me to turn around and meet them at the Speedway gas station there across from Riverview. We arrived there and saw a Marion County Sheriff unmarked car. Two gentlemen got out, which appeared to be deputies. And then Brother Pat Sheehy, who was the president of Brebeuf School, which is where Matt attended, got out. And I knew the news was going to be bad because he was also the chaplain for the Marion County Sheriff's Department. So I was told Aaron was in the car. I pounded on the hood. I don't know what all I did, but headed home with Aaron. And some of the faith came in there because we had planned to have a card club dinner, golf, and so forth at our house with our friends. And as I arrived home, they started arriving, and so it was kind of like God sent someone to comfort us, and so that was very awesome. Karen was out shopping at the time, and then from there, Karen and I and Aaron went back to the bedroom. We prayed. We talked about the services. We talked about cremation and how we were going to deal with it. And that was a God thing to me. At the services, there was about 330 people that attended his service. Also, to me, it was kind of a God thing, and helped me in my faith. When something like this happens, God puts you in a cocoon to get you through the services and the real tough times. And then after that, it's time for grief, and we all grieve differently. It's a tough situation, and you have to grieve differently because you're in different timelines. And I think that's another thing with our faith and the way we grieved that helped save our marriage, because 90% of people or couples who lose a child end up in divorce. And I don't know whether it's blaming one another or how that goes, but that's kind of the situation. For me, I had to try to work on my faith by joining Survivors of Homicide. I also worked with the city of Indianapolis in passing a law for survivors of homicide. I reached out to couples who had lost their loved one. Pete and Donna Kahlo lost Kurt to murder about 6 months after Aaron was murdered, or Matt was murdered. So I coupled with them and just did a number of things to try to keep focused and to try to help my hurt, and that was very helpful to me. One of the things that I heard, and I don't know if this really equates to the faith thing, but one of the verses in the service was Psalm 42-1, and it reads, "As a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God." That I've never forgotten that, and that was very important. So my faith continued to grow, but the grief was still there. My boss interviewed me a year after the event and asked me how I thought I did, and I said, "I think I did pretty good," and he said, "You did terribly." So you're still in this fog for a period of time, and frankly, the only way, in my personal opinion, is to go to God and just ask Him to continue to help you work through this process. And you do get through the process, as Karen said. So my faith continued, as I said, through prayer and asking God for His help, also by joining, as I said, Survivors of Homicide, working with others, discussing with people what they're going to go through on the grief process, because there is a process that you go through. And so as time goes by, one of the things that we were told by some of the people that we met with is that when this happens, it's like waves of an ocean, and those waves are huge, and they're coming about every 2 feet, and as time goes by, they start to subside and generally get to the place where you're reasonably okay, although you never forget, and it's always on your mind. So my faith is God, and I pray to Him every day, and I believe Matthew is with God, and I hope to see him soon.
One other thing I'd like to add, there were 3 pastors that officiated at Matt's memorial, and one of them said, in the course of what he had to say, that hate and anger and revenge are like an acid that eats its container from the inside out. And I've always remembered that, because you can't let an event destroy you. And so I think it's important. I try to share that with people when they're going through a very difficult time. Now, as if that wasn't enough, and we all have lots of stories, Patrick asked us to share another story. So another major event in our life happened about 5 years ago, when our younger son Aaron told us he's gay. I don't know how many of you know this. It's not a secret. It's not anything we try to avoid sharing. It's just not necessarily a conversation starter. You don't walk up to somebody and say, how are you? And by the way, did I tell you our son is gay? So if you don't know, it's not because we didn't want you to know. It just doesn't work itself in the conversation very well, very often. If I said this wasn't a difficult announcement to wrap my head around, I'd be lying. Talk about being blindsided. He just didn't fit the profile. Now, that statement tells you right there how much I had to learn. I didn't have strong opinions one way or the other about homosexuality, and I felt that we all are God's children, and who am I to judge? That was all on an intellectual level, and then it got personal. I grieved for quite a long time, not because he was gay, but because this meant, as far as I was concerned, that a lot of the dreams I had, such as grandchildren, extended family, a daughter-in-law, because we didn't have any girls, were probably not going to happen. I knew he was the same son I loved the day before he told us as the day after. That love didn't change. Again, God and I had a lot of conversations so I could process what this all meant. And at last, God made me realize it wasn't about me. It was about him. And so when I finally realized that, I realized how difficult it had to be for him. No, I probably didn't really know how difficult it was for him to finally come to terms with something that he had denied for many, many years. And then also how difficult it was for him to share that with us. In fact, he was home for a long weekend and we had been with family. And evidently he had wanted to be able to tell us then because we had a lot of car time together and he couldn't do it. So when we dropped him off at the airport, he sent us an email. Let's hear it for modern technology. That's how we found out. Steve was also a very big help. This was something that we could talk about and share with each other, and I don't know that he struggled on the same level as I did, but it's also been very interesting how some of our friends have responded, especially some of our Christian friends. For some, it's just something we don't talk about. And I can't tell you how grateful I am to be a member of a body of believers where I can sit and tell you this and know that you'll still talk to me and not condemn our son. I have 2 stepbrothers. One of them and his wife profess to be very devout believers, and they're very outspoken about how wrong homosexuality is. And unfortunately for Christianity, they give us a bad name. I also have another acquaintance that asked me if I had any idea what Aaron must think when he goes to church. And he and his partner Alan do go to church, and it's a wonderful church. And I was, again, dumbfounded that someone would ask me that question. And all I could think to say was, I hope he knows God loves him. Again, Steve has his own story.
That better? His announcement or pronouncement that he was gay was a shock to me, but probably not as much to Karen. I've known a number of of gay individuals who are quite nice and go to church and all that. I mean, I've never been a big fan of some of these parades they have where, you know, they dance in the street and so forth, but that's not where Aaron and Alan are. So my love for Aaron is unconditional, and as I think my love from God is unconditional. I'm always been a little confused about the Bible and the inspired Word of God and so forth, how it talks about homosexuality. To me, when I listen to the words of Jesus when he met with the prostitute and he met with other people and was all forgiving. And so Karen and I have both given our life to God. And so we know that we will, our salvation is guaranteed. Will we sin? I can't even walk back to the table without sinning. And so I do believe a sin's a sin's a sin equally. I'm not sure I want to put this situation as a sin because I don't know. And I think, in my view, God is the ultimate judge for all of us. And so even though a lot of my friends know that Aaron is gay, and yet they, you know, I still hear the jokes about homosexuals and gays and the put downs and so forth, and I don't know whether they just forgot that I knew or that I told them or whatever. So I can deal with that again through my faith, but I still don't know a lot of the Bible versus what I believe, that God is the only judge, and he will judge us when we are in heaven with him if we have given our life to him. Myself, as I say, I am a sinner, and I pray every day to be forgiven. Doesn't seem to help much because I turn right around and do it. So I know that I have my salvation guaranteed. What I don't know is what seat I'm going to be in. I could be in the top row of the field house when it comes to where I'm going to be, but I do know that I have salvation through Jesus Christ. So I'm completely as comfortable as I can be. We've had great experiences with him and Alan, and that's kind of where we are. So I would end with that.
Give me a lump in my throat the whole time. Two heavy stories. Thank you for sharing. And you did it with such poise. Jeez Louise. Unbelievable. Wow. Was there we'll go back to we'll try to walk both through both stories. We'll talk about Matt's murder and kind of your process through that. There's a sense of, Steve, you kind of talked about just this anger and this rage that kind of poured out when you were first heard about the story there at Speedway, beating the hood of the car, and that, there had to be this moment, and I experience this a lot as I walk alongside people with grief and this loss. There becomes this moment where there's just this kind of uncertainty where you're like, I don't even know how to feel. Like, I'm just numb right now.
Yeah, the pounding on the car was not a pounding of anger, it was a power of losing a son. And I did not know, because they never found the people or persons that murdered Matt, so I didn't know who to be angry with, and so therefore I wasn't. And that's when I tried to. I had a good friend in South Harbor that was a Secret Service agent, and he and I went out together and knocked on doors and tried to get clues, and so I did a lot of that, but I really never was angry at, because again I didn't know. I was never angry with God. I mean, it to me it wasn't about God. I just had to try to continue to pray for him, and that was very helpful.
That's exactly how I felt. I couldn't even, when I got home and Steve met me, I couldn't even cry. It was just like hitting a wall and dropping down into this deep, dark pit. As I say, I don't liken it to the desert as much as I do the pit. And it's cold and it's dark and it's lonely, and I didn't even know what to cry out for. It takes a while to even get to that point to cry. I cry more now probably than I did then.
I think grief it's uncharted territory. And so when I think it hits, there is this, I don't know how to feel, and I hear it a lot. Like, I feel like I should cry, I feel like I should be angry, I feel like I should be whatever, and I'm just nothing. And so I know I've had to give permission a number of times, just be where you are, and that's okay. You talked about, Karen, that you would go to the church, because in your mind, God lived there. And I think that's part of the spiritual process we go through. We need fixed locations, the way that God works, the way that God operates, and then eventually we mature. Hopefully we mature enough in our faith that we realize that God is in all things, that he is everywhere. But there is this where we tie God to stuff. I mean, I know and I think for a lot of people here, God is readily seen and felt in nature. That's easy, and that's an easy place to go to. But there's also something that's powerful about God in a building, or some people even create miniature altars in their church or in their homes, where they feel like that's the place that they need to be in order to kind of center. What is the this is kind of apart from the story, but what is the power of connecting with God in a location?
Well, that was my child's perspective. I didn't have any other perspective because we didn't pray together at home as a family. So I thought you had to go to the building where he was to pray. And as I've become an adult, I really kind of feel like God is my companion. He's there I have conversations with him all the time. I know Joyce Baer would say I'm crazy. That's okay. I do. I talk to him all the time. He speaks to me through music. He speaks to me through other people. But he's always there. If I ever have anything I need to talk to him about, I just talk, and he's there, which was a whole different perspective than I had growing up. So it's been a very long learning, growing process.
Grief is Steve, you said that your life has been so blessed. I don't think there are many people that say, if you were to say, my son is murdered, they'd say, oh, you've had a really blessed life. That's not the reaction we get from not only people in our culture, but people in church. That's the murder of your son's not a blessing. And I wouldn't say you'd say necessarily that's a blessing, but there are blessings that certainly come in the peripheral of that. And so something as heavy and as deep and as profound as this becomes this holy moment. And Karen, you said that you had to go to God alone. And when you said that, I got this, I went back to the Old Testament, my mind went back to the Old Testament of the priest entering into the Holy of Holies. And they could only do that once a year, and only one priest could do that. And they would tie a rope to his ankle, because if he was unholy, he'd die in there, and they wouldn't be able to get him out. So they'd drag him out with a rope so that they could clear the space out. But as you were talking, I just thought, man, your grief sounds like that. that your grief brought you to this holy place where only you and God could go. Like, the words of anyone else would just fail you in that moment. Is that
Part of it was I knew I could say anything and he would hear me. I didn't feel that same comfort level with people. I'm a pretty private person, and to share is not necessarily beneficial for me to share with other. I'll share if I think it's going to help them, but I have to have that one-on-one. I really do see him as my loving, nurturing, caring father who's always there. And I have to sit in his lap and tell him all of my fears and everything, because he's the one that's going to make me feel better.
And Steve, yours is the opposite. Maybe you went to God and you cried out to God, but you then enter into these support groups. You needed to hear the story of others whose scars looked similar to yours.
Yeah, I talked to anyone who would talk to me as far as when I saw something or heard something from my work or the church or something like that, where people had a similar situation on the loss of a child, whether it was murder or accident or whatever. And I can't remember who reached out to us, but there was someone that reached out to us, and so I would reach out to them and try to explain as best I could, which is not very good, what they're going to go through on grieving. I went to Kahlo's trial, and I think the 3 guys were convicted to 80 years. And I asked Donna Kahlo, Pete's wife, I said, does that help? And she said, no. I mean, the loss of a child and then putting someone in prison doesn't bring back your child. Yeah, I reached out to a lot of people, and that helped me also in my faith, because I could help and yet still be able to talk to God about Matt.
I think Patrick has maybe brought up a point that he doesn't realize he's brought up. But we learned as a couple, especially that first year after losing Matt, that we couldn't be there for each other. We were too into our own grief. And this is why I think couples get divorced. We'd be at different points on different days. And you can't be there for someone else when you're so deep in your own grief. So fortunately for us, and again, it was a blessing, he was able to find where he could go to work through his, and I could go where I needed to go. And that was the mutual respect we had for each other, so that we could get through this. We'd get through it together, but not necessarily being there for each other, if you understand what I'm saying. And that's really something that's important to know when you have a major event in your life. You can't always be there for the other person.
Yeah, I think also for me, I mean, if you want to call it a blessing, and I somewhat do, is later in life, I was threatened to be killed by a gentleman down in Indianapolis. His wife was my best salesman, and he murdered her and threatened me, and for me to be able to be with their family, they found Beth, she was murdered in February, and they found her in April. But to be able to sit with that family, and they appreciated the prayers and again, some of the situations they were going to have to go through in the future. So from that standpoint, that was a blessing.
And you guys have walked alongside, you've been able to walk alongside a number of parents who've lost their children. It's not something, again, you don't really put a business card out there that's like, hey, something happens, and you can't really do that. But I know that you guys have always made yourself available to walk alongside those families and those parents in particular, because you know other people need to have scars, need to see other people with scars that look similar to theirs. As you were talking, as you know, as we were working through and working towards today, I just kept thinking and praying for you guys in preparation. And the psalm that came to me was Psalm 121, and it says, I look up to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord who has made the heaven and the earth. And there is a power in the church family to be able to lean upon them. But at some point in your life, you also just kind of step back and you realize even what a loving church family can do is limiting to all that God is. And you can only kind of throw yourself on the altar of God for his love and grace and concern. Let's talk about Aaron. I imagine when you start talking about Aaron, about most of the people in here started squirming. Church doesn't talk about gay and homosexuality and those topics very well. Something we certainly need to do a better job of, because we don't know how to love. And you said it perfectly, Karen, that you had to learn how to see things differently. We have to learn how to love in difficult situations like this, right?
It's a whole different level when you go from intellectual to personal. And it is a learning process. I have to say, I am so impressed with the church that Aaron and Alan attend in Dallas. It is the most eclectic church I have ever been in. There are families, there are homosexual couples, there is probably every nationality represented there. It's the way I think a church should be, and it's pretty amazing. And they know that God loves them, and it's okay to be there. I thought, what a horrible thing to say to somebody, well, how do you feel when you go to church? Unfortunately, Christianity's maybe picked out one thing that's the ultimate sin. There's a whole lot of other sinning going on out there. So, you know, I think we all have to be, that it's only through God's grace, not anything we do. And so, yeah, it's different.
How do we, what advice do you have for us? How do we love, accept, create space? How do we do a better job of doing that? Because for a lot of people in the church that have grown up in the church, like that's like, and I always find this to be interesting. If we actually, whether we see it as a sin or not, if you believe that the power of God can transform and change you, it seems like the church would want to do everything in their power to make sure that these two tables, where the shepherds are, because we know they're the biggest sinners in church, is why they sit up front, because they need as much holiness as possible. But I'm kidding, this is a joke. But if we believe that God is this transforming power, the church should bend low to make sure that they're very accommodating to those people who are most broken, not only by our own judgments, but just by the standards of the world. Those who are economically struggling, who are those who have been racially excluded, those who, whatever the case may be, those who get pushed aside by the culture, that we should be making sure that they have a space where they can come and hopefully hear the story of God to experience transformation. But yet we kind of say, no, you're not welcome here, you're not allowed in here, but you better change. None of that has ever made sense to me. It's regardless of how you see, if you see it as sin or not, and there's all sorts of big conversations, great conversations, but we don't do that well, right? We don't create space for people to come, as we say, as you are. Paul's chapter in Romans, where he says, nothing separates us from the love of God. And I always say, in Christianity, there's an asterisk that says that, unless you're homosexual. And then that God's love can't overcome that. We got to do better, right? And we got to let people be I mean, you shared, as we've shared in the stories, you said, Aaron came out in email, apparently, and he came out and he said, I'm not any different. I'm still Aaron. I'm still Aaron. And so it didn't change who he was, didn't change your relationship with him. Just your expectations, your dreams, particularly yours, Karen, had to dream, had to change. And Steve, we've had some jokes and some conversations about it of not being able to understand it, but yet the love and the support is still there.
Oh, yeah.
You don't have to understand someone to love them. And I think the one thing we have to do is quit judging everybody else. Until you have walked a mile in somebody else's shoes, you have no idea what it's all about. And to judge and say what you do is wrong and what I do is okay just doesn't cut it.
Yeah, to me, you can disagree with people on different issues, but you have to leave the judging up to God. And God is a loving God, and because we give our life to Him, and He assures us of a place in heaven, He knows we're going to sin, and that's why He asks us to continue to pray and to work on and not sin. And again, on the issue of homosexuality, I don't know whether you're born with that. I don't know, and I just leave that issue up for God to be the judge, and I move on down the road.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to do. I mean,
Yeah.
I love you guys, and we had this kind of came to for us 5 years ago. I don't know if you remember, we were here doing a weekly conversation, and I thought, man, if I ever have to talk to the Jameses about this conversation, it's not going to go, it's just not going to go well. And you called me out in the middle of the dinner discussion that night, and I thought, oh my goodness, Steve, I love you so much. I didn't want to talk about it or bring it up because I'm like, that doesn't matter. It has no bearing on our relationship. And you kind of called me out on it. Part of it, I think, is about the time that Aaron came out, and you guys were searching for ground to stand on, and I didn't realize the motivation behind it. But we talked about it a little bit, and you said, yeah, I agree. I think we put way too much emphasis on it. And just I know the pressure that gave me, that took off my shoulders of knowing that that our relationship could be fully transparent, and that we could overlook topics that we disagreed on. I mean, Steve, I disagree with you on a lot of stuff. I see your Facebook feed, and sometimes I just shake my head. I'm like, Karen, we gotta shut that down. Don't let Steve get on Facebook, please. And yet, despite that, there's more to our relationship than the political stuff that's out there.
Sorry.
God's working on you, I know He is. So, and He's working on me, maybe more so. There's this interesting thing, and a lot of people don't know about it, but in the first century church, there was actually two saints, Saint Sergius and Saint Bacchus, that they were two gay saints that were a couple, and they served actually in the Roman army. And they're hidden. You got to really dig deep to find that. But we see this. It's in our church history. It's in our past that may be the thing, maybe a sin, whatever you want to call it, but yet they can still love God. And we're willing to overlook things like anger or lust or whatever. We let those things kind of go. We permit space for people to be angry in the church. When Jesus vehemently speaks out about not being angry and bearing your anger and getting beyond that, or greedy or injustice, these things are things that Jesus spoke about, but yet we create a lot of space for those in our culture. And I think we have to surrender people to God and let them work through their own faith, at their own relationship, at the way that God leads and moves, and that's hard because I don't know about you guys, but I love control. Not only in my own life, but I kind of enjoy controlling other people's lives too. So, so that's a hard thing to surrender to and to die to, and to let God work on them and to be present with them. And so, thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing your life. Again, to still lump in my throat on just both of these stories, and I pray that in hearing you, that we're encouraged, that we're challenged to look at our own lives, but also to create space for love to happen in difficult, unimaginable circumstances, but also with those that we sometimes struggle to love and be closest to. So thank you.
Any questions for?
Yeah, let's take a couple. We'll create space for just a couple of questions, if there's any questions from the Faith family.
I just want to say I really appreciate you guys sharing. It's, no parent can listen to the story and think, like, gosh, I could do that, right? It's just an incredible journey that you've been on. I know for me, I've always had a tendency to whitewash faith, right? This idea that the faith has to be this absence of questions and absence of fear. And I think I've learned, and as I've heard stories like this, that often it's about proceeding with questions and with fears. Is there anything that you can share that as you kind of had to move forward on either one of these stories of some of those fears or those questions that you had to kind of move forward in spite of?
I'll let you take this one so I can be
Okay.
mobile.
I have a lot of control issues, if you don't already know that.
What? What? Shocker.
I know you find that shocking. And again, I think that's one of the hardest things to deal with. I mean, sometimes God has to smack me in the head with a 2x4 to get my attention and let me know that I'm not in control. He is, I'm not. But I have to work through not being able to be in control, and the fear that if I'm going to share this with somebody, I am going to lose all control and not be able to regain it. I can't tell you how much I dreaded this morning, but how much peace I had once I came up here. And I can only attribute that to God, because trust me, this is one of the hardest things to do for me.
Yeah, we like the perception that we want others to have of us. And when you put your story out there, you have no control whether or not their perception can or might change. And at some point, you have to surrender that.
And I think if there's any husbands out here who don't think that their wives are the controlling factor, they need to see me.
Other questions? I think it's pretty amazing. I think that the thing that I find astounding is that there was in your story, there was never a why me, God? Why us? Like, you never questioned in that regard, and it's very similar. Job never questions, like, he's like, God has a reason. I wish he'd tell me, but he has a reason. There's something here, and he gets frustrated and he gets angry, but there's never this blaming. And I think we live in a culture that likes to blame. We like to be able to point the finger and say, that's your fault. And I think for me, that's probably the most astounding part, that you never in this journey, and maybe there were days or moments or whatever, but it doesn't sound like you ever went to this place where you're like, how dare you, God? You were able to go with him and be angry, but without pointing that finger towards him. And that's, I don't know if I know of anybody who's gone through such a difficult experience and not done that. So that just baffles me.
Asking why doesn't serve any purpose.
Doesn't matter, we still do it.
Well, but I firmly believe God gave us free will, and because he did that, people do things that hurt other people, over which we have no control. And that comes with free will to make good or bad choices. And we have to live with it. God didn't promise us everything would be wonderful. He just promised us he'd be there when they aren't.
Yeah, what was amazing to me is that after Matt was murdered, we would sit around the dinner tables, we always do, and sometimes the TV would be on, and you see it every day where someone is murdered or killed in a bad accident, and you think it's never going to be us. And so those thoughts are not true, and you just got to be prepared that it can happen to you and it can happen to your friends, and just pray that they will accept the bad and the good.
Thank you again. Certainly things that we'll meditate and think about for a long time to come. Let me offer you this for our benediction. Almighty God, give us wisdom to perceive you, intellect to understand you, diligence to seek you, patience to wait for you, eyes to behold you, a heart to meditate upon you, and life to proclaim you. Through the power of the Spirit of our Lord Jesus Christ. May God be with you. Go in God's peace.